Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like it need Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like it need Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off.
Blast off on another episode of Hero Paranormal Podcast, broadcasting from the base at La Madre Mountain, just south of Area 51. My name is Ryan, the original outlaw of the airwaves, bringing you an epic episode today. We're going deep into green territory. Yeah, discussing some of the most controversial issues of our time. We're going to get into cannabis in the Bible, the devil's lettuce. And we are talking with an expert on the subject, Mr. Chris Bennett, author of LIBER 420, Cannabis, Magical Herbs, and the Occult. He's also the author of various books on this subject and has a long history of delving into the research, heavy research with alchemical roots. We're going to talk about how Masons, Rosicrucians, and the Illuminati are all involved with, acknowledging this, and how this holy grail of greenery is not just a modern pastime or drug of choice for hippies. This is something that's been taking place historically throughout mankind for a long time. Sure, a new world is emerging, one where the earth and many states are becoming open to the idea. This is not a new subject, and this is not a new subject to Chris Bennett, who has really gone to great lengths. If you haven't read the book LIBER 420, I highly recommend it. And his other books are also amazing. So we're going to get into all of this goodness. His other books include Cannabis and the Soma Solution, and Sex, Drugs, Violence, and the Bible, just to name a few. You may want to get a little Visine for that third eye, because this is going to be a heck of an episode with a heck of a guest. Mr. Chris Bennett, welcome to the Hero Paranormal Podcast.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here.
Chris, I have been itching to talk to you for quite some time about your magnificent work, LIBER 420, not to mention Cannabis and the Soma Solution. You have Sex, Drugs, Violence, and the Bible, the laundry list of amazing research you've done and book titles that lend credence to this. It's really touched me, and I think that a new world is emerging as far as cannabis. It's seeming like a very new thing with dispensaries that look like banks, and it's very cliche and getting popularized. But this is a subject matter that has been around a very long time, and you've touched on the spiritual uses and have a very convincing case of how cannabis has been tied and connected to the occult, Illuminati, Freemasons, and much, much more. Where do we start this off?
Well, the story of man's relationship with cannabis for its psychoactive potential, for shamanic purposes, for religious purposes, is one of the oldest cultural stories around. Carl Sagan speculated that cannabis was, in fact, humanity's first agricultural crop, and we certainly know from archaeological evidence that production of cannabis fiber products like rope and cloth can go anywhere from 10,000 to 25,000 years. In regards to its use for intoxicating purposes, there's evidence from Indo-European sites going back at least 5,500 years from the Ukraine, Romania, places like that it was used in rituals involving funeral practices. And this sort of use continued on with Indo-European culture for thousands of years. So the ritual use of cannabis is, really older than any existing religions. And as you mentioned, I've tried to make a case to show its role in the inception period of a number of longtime world religions. And it's really fascinating, the sort of archaeological evidence and the textual evidence that there is out there to back up such claims.
Yeah, and you've backed these up in a way that was previously unavailable, at least to my eyes, with a variety of books. We've named a few. Others are Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana in Magic and Religion. You have Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible. There are numerous books that you've published, and you've published various articles on the same subject. And something that I like about the scope of your research is that usually people do not realize the pivotal role that marijuana has played in the foundation of ancient civilizations.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's phenomenal. Like culture grew out of agriculture, and as we've cultivated cannabis, it's cultivated us. And there's a lot to be seen in that. We almost have a symbiotic relationship with this plant, like in regards to human culture, but even like biologically, the receptor sites that the cannabinoids attach to only react that way because of their similarity to endocannabinoids that occur naturally in the body. And rare things like gamma-linoleic acid found in the hemp seeds, found in human mother's milk. And there's endocannabinoids in human mother's milk as well. And other biological kind of connections, and, there may be some sort of explanation that we kind of figure out, if you are what you eat. We've been growing this plant in our own human waste for thousands and thousands of years, and having this interaction with it. And, it's a very keen thing. And, I believe that cannabis is the very tree of life, and that it's here in this time by no accident that we're rediscovering this lost history. And there's something very important happening with cannabis and going to happen. The best is yet to come in regards to cannabis. This information about the religious use, I've been doing this research for over 30 years, has yet to really sink in outside of, the more deeper seekers in the cannabis world, but it will. And when it does, it's going to cause a revolution in thought in the theological world in a very powerful way.
I agree. And it feels as if, at least in my opinion, that as soon as there was money to be made on it by major corporations, as we're seeing in this era that of modern dispensaries, it's no longer the mom and pop on the corner doing this. As soon as there's profit to be made and, public shares and board meetings and all of this in the medical industry, of course, it is being utilized for profit making. And going back just a little bit, I want to get into, you mentioned your search and wisdom into this research, and you've really delved deeply. What got you started down this pathway? What was the spark that lit the fire to get you to produce so much literature and offer so much to us in the form of all of your research?
Well, I had a very powerful religious experience with cannabis a little over 30 years ago in the winter of 89-90. And that led me to try to understand what had taken place, whether I just had, I was stoned and just tripped out, or whether there was anything to that experience, I can tell you about that, I guess. It's a story I've told often, and I get asked about this a lot. But in the 80s and 90s, I was really just a hardcore surfer. I grew weed, worked a few nights a week as a night watchman in a fish plant, and a series of events brought about this religious experience. And the first of these was the Catholic Church was in a big scandal here in Canada. It involved an orphanage where children had been being molested decades before, and these people had grown up, and they started coming out and making these accusations against the church. And and this is like common type of news nowadays, but at this time it was kind of the first story here in Canada that broke the silence on this troubling matter. And so I thought, oh, that's so weird. I was like, it wasn't, my parents weren't really hardcore Christians or anything, but I just always kind of believed the Bible, naturally, just culturally. And I thought, well, I'm going to read the Bible, see what this thing's all about, see what, it seems so weird that was happening to me. And so I bought a Bible and I started reading it. I couldn't get into it. And I stuck it in the St. Watchman's office at the fish plant. And then coinciding with this, a friend of mine recorded a documentary on hemp. And at this time, the term hemp itself had kind of fallen out of the language here in Canada in regards to cannabis. We didn't even know what hemp was when people started talking about it. And then he said, well, it's cannabis and you can make all this stuff. But I grew cannabis. I thought I knew everything there was to know about it. And I was like, no way. And then I started looking it up in encyclopedias. And sure enough, there was this whole fascinating history about its industrial applications. And where I lived on the west coast of Vancouver Island, there was a great controversy about the logging of the last old-growth rainforest, Clackwood Sound. And my family, my brother was the IWA, the union camp chairman for the loggers and stuff. So, and I'd worked in the forest industry and things myself. And all of a sudden there was this big environmental movement happening out there trying to save the last old-growth coastal rainforest in Canada. And I thought, oh, well, we could make paper out of hemp. And I started becoming really interested in it. And then around the same time, the Gulf War started in Iraq, and I'd seen this little clip about Saddam Hussein, how he thought he was connected to Nebuchadnezzar, the last king of Babylon, and had fired a Scud missile into Israel. And Nebuchadnezzar conquered the Israelites in the Old Testament storyline. And one night I was like sitting in this fish plant smoking a joint, and there was an ad for a sermon. This is a time before the internet, so television stations, all that type of stuff had printouts in the newspaper. And there was an ad for a sermon. Pat Robertson was Revelations 18, the fall of Babylon. There's Robertson at the pulpit, and behind him he had pictured tanks and jets. And I was like, wow, he's tying in this Gulf War with the Book of Revelation. And we're getting close to the end of the millennium here. I think everybody was kind of in a bit of a apocalyptic fervor there as we approached 2000. And I'd seen The Omen when I was a kid, and I thought, well, I'm going to read the Book of Revelation right now, And so I opened it up and I start reading it. And John, he's given this scroll, and it tastes as sweet as honey in his mouth, and he swallows it, and he begins to prophesize. And I was like, what has he eaten? And then I started reading further, and it's talking about clothes made of sackcloth and incense, billowing clouds of incense with the prayers of all the saints. And I was like, this is trippy. And I got to the end of the Bible, and I read Revelations 22, and it says, on either side of the river of life stood the tree of life, bearing 12 manners of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And when I read that, I had this experience where I felt like light just beamed into me, and that this was a reference to cannabis and all these different fruits where its industrial applications that we could use to save the planet, whether that be biomass fuels to replace petroleum, or hemp paper, renewable crop, instead of cutting down old-growth forests to make pulp and paper, or whether it be like the protein from the hemp seed itself is one of the most pure forms of digestible proteins because it's the richest source of essential fatty acids. And, hemp cloth to replace soil-depleting cotton. The list is endless, right? And that the healing leaves were this medicine. And so, I called up my wife at the time, my first wife. I've been married a few times, and started talking. She thought I was having some sort of mental breakdown, And I'm lucky I didn't get picked up, put into a hospital that night because I was like really in a manic kind of state. And then the next day I got up, and I was like, wow, was there anything to that? Or was I just tripping out or what? And I thought, well, if there is, then somebody somewhere else will have had an experience like this. There'll be something written about it somewhere. And I just kind of went in this kind of manic state trying to identify what had happened to me and accumulating information on the role of cannabis in various religions, and this went on for decades, right? It's the only thing I actually write about it. I've written like 4 huge books, working on the 5th, and they've all been related to this same experience, And I'm saying that 30 years later, that the information is out there now to show that cannabis, just from a purely, you could be a total atheist, and I think if I laid down cannabis's role to you in the ancient world, particularly in the Near East, you would see that cannabis was in fact recognized as the tree of life in Assyria by ancient Canaanites and polytheistic Hebrews, and it is here again. And what happened to me was real. Something did feed me information, and I followed up on it, and it's proven itself. And I'm quite convinced of that. And I'd have you to debate it with anybody.
It's a grand mystical secret, and it's amazing how you had a spiritual experience and literally stumbled upon it. But I find that it's very interesting. I've been looking deeply into alchemical philosophers, and A.E. Waite in his book Lives of the Alchemistical Philosophers says the gold of the philosopher is not a metal. And you find this throughout history in the search of health and happiness, that many basically, I guess, allude to the fact. It's funny how this is skirted so often, but, and this is why I want to bring up Soma, which was unquestionably the greatest and holiest of these ancient Indian worships. And can we go into Soma, the offered beverage that was used for religious and spiritual experiences, and how you came across that connection?
Well, when I first started researching it, when I wrote my first books, Green Gold, The Tree of Life, and Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, I was fully accepting R. Gordon Wasson's theory of the fly agaric mushroom, right? Mm-hmm. It was just so, it's been just so accepted by everybody. And I knew all sorts of people that I respected that also held that view, like Carl Ruck, for instance, and other people. And I didn't really start looking into it till much later. And it was like, I don't think people had the opportunity to write the type of books I write, even like 30 years ago, because back in those days, you were pretty much tied to libraries and what you could access through libraries and private collections and stuff like that. But in our own time, Google has scanned millions of books and put them all in a huge database. So you can do an index search of like hundreds of libraries, thousands of libraries worth of books with just a quick look around. You know what I mean? And I was, just happened to be born in that time period, like the rest of us, where this was new, And so by starting to Google around a little bit, word-based combinations like soma and hayoma, the Persian counterpart of soma, from the Avestan religion that grew into Zoroastrianism, and hemp and cannabis and various spellings and whatnot, all of a sudden I was able to get access to previous people, a century ago, and in between that, that had all speculated about cannabis and soma, and there's actually been a pretty strong case for it even before I had delved into this, But the current, I think, based on the most up-to-date archaeological and textual evidence, I think that the case for cannabis and soma, and you have to remember that it was known as soma in India, and it was part of the Aryan Vedic religion. This was a religion that came into India with Indo-European or Aryan people. And they also spread to other areas of the world, such as into Persia, where they had the Avestan religion, and they had a similar sacrament called hayoma. And the only difference is the dialectic changes. These languages and religions grew out of an identical earlier ancestor, right? And we know this because of the similarity in the text and the similarity in the languages and whatnot. It's not like a theory or anything like that. And they were connected with wider Indo-European groups such as the Scythians, who are well-known nomadic people that were, one of the first people to domesticate the horse and things. And they spread even into far off China. And we know that they were there because there's been a lot of recent archaeological evidence regarding Indo-European mummies that were found in central China. And these are variously known under different names, but popularly the Yushi or the Gushi tribes. And we know they were Indo-European speaking, Indo-European people living amongst the Han Chinese, the indigenous Chinese. And they were very much into cannabis. And we know this because of really well-preserved archaeological evidence that survives in this very arid, dry, cold climate. And we've found, bouquets of female cannabis, preserved cannabis buds, tools, and then altars used for burning cannabis that were used in funerary rites, much like the ones I mentioned earlier by Indo-Europeans, even thousands of years earlier than this. And so this is these time period in China that I'm talking about is like from 2800 to about 2600, 2500 or so that these artifacts are all from, right? And in China, the name for given, like they have a long history of cannabis themselves, independent, largely for fiber and food purposes. But they began using a term while these Indo-Europeans were in the region, huma. And huma has been interpreted as fire cannabis because they burnt it, but also as Scythian cannabis. Scythians, a group. And one of the Scythian names was the Heoma Varga, the gatherers of Heoma, because they transported. They were highly nomadic, and we know from Scythian artifacts that they both drank and burnt cannabis. There's numbers of finds in Scythian tombs. These go all the way into the Russian steppes and all over the place. They're all over the place into Western Europe. And the Scythians are largely credited with spreading the ritual use of cannabis throughout the ancient world, as well as a lot of the common, like a lot of the Indo-European languages, French, German, English, can be shown to come from the same Indo-European root con. So even our own cannabis adapted, which is adapted from the Latin, but comes down through the same Indo-European roots, right? Mm-hmm. And in Scythian tombs, they found incense burners as well as gold goblets that were used to drink in preparation of cannabis mixed with opium. And it's believed by Russian archaeologists that this was evidence of Heoma, the drink of the Zoroastrians, and it's quite clear the Zoroastrians and the Scythians, although they were known in Persia as the Sakas, interacted heavily in trade and cultural traditions. And there's a site that was known as a trading, like the Chinese sites where this Indo-Europeans have gone. They've altered our concept of trade in the ancient world. Before, things like the Spice Road were thought to have opened up around 200 BC. Now it's gone back 1,000, maybe even 2,000 years earlier than that. And we know from artifacts exchanged, found at these sites, that the Chinese Gushi, the people in China, the Indo-Europeans in China, that they were in trade with a region in Afghanistan known as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. And this is one of the spots that the Avestan religion that used Heoma were located. And in this site, a Russian archaeologist, Victor Sarianati, has found 3 temple sites about the size of football fields, and half these temple sites were dedicated to the preparation of a sacred beverage that contained cannabis, ephedra, and in some cases opium. And the idea is, and this, I don't want to present this as my own material. I'm building this out of a variety of other researchers. The idea, come up with a number of different linguists, is that the Chinese term huma, Heoma, came down with the Scythians, who were known as Heoma Varga and burnt cannabis and used cannabis from archaeological evidence, into this region known as Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. and came with a name that it traveled with from China, Huma, and this became Heoma. And through further dialectic changes, when these people expanded into India with the Aryan invasion of India, became Soma of the Vedas, you know. And so that's kind of like the nutshell version. But there's all sorts of other material, stories, linguistic stuff related to that. But that's kind of the basis for the claim, you know. And, you know, when I really took a closer look at Watson's material regarding his claims about Soma, is that, you know, he's really far-reaching. Like there's, you know, you got to remember the term Soma in the Vedas is used in a variety of different ways. Soma's a god, Soma's the moon, Soma's a drink, Soma's a plant. And, you know, the moon in the sky was seen as a celestial cup of Soma from which the gods drank. And as it waned, it was being drunk. And as it was replenished, it was being refilled. And all the Soma rituals were wound up with the movements of the moon because of that. And probably for agricultural purposes as well, you know, following the seasons and all that type of stuff. And Watson was often interpreting these references that are clearly to the moon as, you know, for building his identification of Soma. And in his arguments for Soma, he left out the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda and the other Vedic texts, and was referring to a substitution. Well, substitution did come into play at a later time. This is why the identity of Soma was lost, but it has nothing to do with it being a mushroom, which was quite clearly prohibited. Mushrooms were prohibited food for Brahmins and other people going way back in the Vedic religion, because it was, you know, identified with growing a manure and things like that, right? Which was unclean in their eyes. Yeah, there's a lot more to it than that you can explain in a brief description, but that's kind of the basic case for cannabis and Heoma. And if you search around on cannabis and Soma or Heoma online, you'll probably find some articles I wrote where I go into more detail and link to other material relating to this.
It's fascinating, the effort mind-blowing, man, just mind-blowing. And nothing more. It's just mind-blowing to me how much is in this subject matter, and kind of bringing it back to a bit more of a Western idea or ideology of the Illuminati, Bavaria, 1776. It is very well documented that Weishaupt and his cohorts were partaking of this, and partaking of the Tree of Life, as you've said. And I find it also interesting that in a book that predates 1776 out of Berlin in 1714, by the title A True and Complete Preparation of the Philosopher's Stone by the Order of the Golden Rosicrucians, again, this is mentioned. And when we come even to the United States and the beginnings of the mystery schools here in the United States with P.B. Randolph and the Rosicrucians here, the oldest secret societies here, it is also amazing that P.B. Randolph was the first major hashish dealer. And I found it interesting that he was meeting with spiritualists, mediums, and others working with magnetism, mesmerism, and most of whom also used hashish. And I believe he first used hashish in France in 1855. And there is a long list to the aid to the development of clairvoyance, allowing other feats with the use of these substances. So this has permeated pretty much every culture, and it blows my mind that I recently heard, and unfortunately I can't find the information, that in the Bible, it's in your book as well, but I can't find it. I'm looking for it, but it's somewhere in the 777 pages of magic here, that a lot of this anointing with oils that we hear of biblically may have very well been CBD oils or things of the like.
Absolutely. Well, this is something I've written a lot about. And this goes back, I think the most compelling evidence, is recent archaeological evidence out of Israel where cannabis was found at a temple site. But my books, even LIBER 420, were written long before this was known. And when I was writing, say, my 2000 book, Sex, Drugs, Violence, and the Bible, I was taking a really close look at references to this Hebrew term, cannabis, that occurs in Exodus 30:23, in Ezekiel, in the Song of Songs, in Jeremiah, and in the book of Isaiah. And Sula Bennett, who was a Polish anthropologist and etymologist, suggested that this term was a reference to cannabis based on following the modern term back and showing it similar terms for cannabis, cannaba, in the later periods of the Hebrew language, as well as similarity to Assyrian terms for cannabis, cannaba, and similar ways that it was used. And generally, most Bibles translate, modern King James and stuff like that, translate it as calamus or fragrant cane. And Sula Bennett believed that when the Hebrew was translated into the Greek, a couple thousand years ago, that they made a mistake and they mistranslated this term as calamus, and this followed through in all later translations, right? Mm-hmm. It's a very controversial theory. In the first of these references, Exodus 30:23, God appears to Moses in flames of fire within a burning bush. God commands him to make a holy anointing oil with about 9 pounds of this cannabis, cannabis, and mixed with myrrh and cinnamon and cassia into about 1.5 gallons of olive oil. And every time that Moses is to speak to the Lord, he's to anoint his skin with this oil, as well as place some of this oil on the altar of incense. And then he speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the altar of incense. And he never discusses anything with the Lord other than when this is burning and the smoke pillar's there. And the other people of Israel, they never talk to God. They only know that Moses is talking to God if he's inside what's called the tent of the meeting, and smoke's coming out of it, right? Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly, in 2020, a number of, there's a lot of news stories about this. You can check out, anybody listening. In Arad, Jerusalem, going back to about 700 BC, they found a temple site, Jewish temple site. And there were 2 altars at this site. And the temple room itself was about the size of a broom closet, very small, tight area that would have been enclosed. And on one altar was burnt frankincense, and on the other altar was burnt a cannabis resin product, not raw cannabis, but a cannabis resin product. So it proves that there was this use of cannabis going back to this time period in ancient Israel. Now, it's a very complicated story because what these references to cannabis and the archaeology in Arad, Jerusalem, show is the reasons how it became prohibited. And the big thing here is that these later references, the first of these, I'll go with the Song of Songs reference. It appears in a beautiful garden and, again, associated with anointing oil. But, the Song of Songs itself is kind of like a wedding story. Solomon and the Shulamite is how it's portrayed. Then in the Isaiah reference, God complains that he has not been brought any cannabis, but he's been worried with the burden of sacrifices of their sins and stuff like that. So he's pissed off because he's not getting his due of cannabis. But elsewhere, it's pretty clear that it's not always the case, because we read again in Isaiah how one of the seraphim flew from the altar with a tongue of incense. He held it to my lips, and lo, my iniquity is taken away and my sin was purged. So the seraphim basically picks up with tongs a burning coal from the altar of incense and holds it to Isaiah's mouth so he can get a direct hit, in Ezekiel, the reference to cannabis is it coming in on a trade caravan, and then the final reference occurs in the book of Jeremiah at a time where Israel's being, taken down by foreign kingdoms, Assyrians, Babylonians, and whatnot. Cannabis is condemned, and through Jeremiah, God says, "What do I care from your kanaf blossom from a distant land, your incense of Sheba?" And it's condemned, And elsewhere in Jeremiah, we find that it is associated with the Queen of Heaven, and the people of Israel were burning incense to the Queen of Heaven. And Jeremiah, being a monotheist, is very condemning of this behavior. And this is what happens with cannabis, is that although not widely known, you can easily look around to verify what I'm saying. I'm not making outlandish claims here. For a large part of the history of Israel, the region was polytheistic, and that means the worship of more than one God. It wasn't that they didn't worship Yahweh, who we know as Jehovah, the biblical God, but it was not Yahweh alone worship in there. And even in the book of Kings and Chronicles, this is detailed quite well. And one of the most popular deities that was worshipped during this polytheistic period was Yahweh's one-time wife, Asherah, also known as the Queen of Heaven. And others had written about, such as the botanist William M. Bowden, her cult. She's a Canaanite goddess. Her worship goes back, thousands and thousands of years. Was often associated with the use of cannabis, incense, and anointing oils as well. And the Song of Songs is likely a remnant of this polytheistic period, as Solomon himself was accused of burning incense to the Queen of Heaven on high. It's all throughout the Bible, these accusations against Solomon. Mm-hmm. And may well be like the Semitic version of the Near Eastern literature, say, like that's devoted to Ishtar and Tamuzi, who are two god and goddess who are married, and also involved with cannabis. We know from Assyrian references to Kanabu that Kanabu was used as a oil perfume by the cult of Ishtar and other Near Eastern goddesses as well, right? And archaeologically, there have been scores of these goddess figurines that represent this Hebrew goddess Asherah found throughout Israel, as well as a number of inscriptions that refer to Yahweh and his Asherah and show them as husband and wife. And so she was the Queen of Heaven. And by the time of Jeremiah, as I mentioned, his text takes place during a time when the Israelites were getting conquered by foreign nations like the Babylonians, Assyrians, and the whole list goes on, up to the time of Jesus. Of foreign nations dominating the area. And there was a need to consolidate the kingdom. And, there was no division between religion and politics that way. And monotheism, as much as a religious revolution, was a political one, because there would be only one God that everybody worshiped, that everybody gave offerings to, and that was the God of the kingdom, the God of the king, his representative on earth. The king was the holy king, God's representative. And polytheism did not fit in with that. And this is why cannabis became out of favor in the Old Testament period, and why it disappeared, and now why we're finding out about both the artifacts of the goddess, but also this temple site in Arad, Jerusalem. And as I mentioned, there were two altars in this temple site in Arad, Jerusalem. One was burnt for burning frankincense, and the other was used for burning cannabis. There was also two altar stones in the site as well, one for Yahweh and one for his wife Asherah. And there's this site was already known before the cannabis residues were discovered as a archaeological site that attested to the combined worship of Yahweh and Asherah, And we could take a look at, how the prohibition of the entheogens and erasing them from history has affected history. But when you consider erasing the divine feminine from history and the thousands of years followed of women being second-class citizens, even chattel and possession, as identified in the Old Testament, owned by men. The results of that are monumental, horrific, and to be atoned for.
Totally, yes. Overbinding control. And I'm so glad you brought up the divine feminine. It's such a big part of this and the ancient religions. I'm blown away. If you don't mind, there's a paragraph on in your book, Liber 420, on page 227. And if it's okay, I'd like to read just a portion of this paragraph.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
The name arcanum, plural arcana, comes from the Latin arcanus, or secret. It came into use as the Dark Ages transitioned into the Renaissance, as alchemists were commonly said to be pursuing the arcana, or secrets of nature, which resulted in the discovery of elixirs for curing disease, extending lives, as well as a means of deeper knowledge. The word itself came to be used to describe these same preparations. And with the mystery schools, secret societies, and kind of bringing back how all of this sort of trickles into American Freemasonry, and our founding fathers had many plantations of hemp. And, I find it just fascinating how this has been behind the veil from the general public for millennia. And with the occult here in the United States, which is, a little bit selfish to only look at ourselves, but we see the same thing. We see the hashish, or this psychic substance, being used by, probably the most influential occultists, namely Aleister Crowley, Madame Blavatsky, P.B. Randolph. They were all users of hashish. Mm-hmm. And it seems that in the search for soul consciousness, this is sort of the VIP plant. And this goes heavily into that divine feminine that you mentioned. And it is just mind-blowing to me, all of the layers that have been hidden from the masses.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's mind-blowing to me too. Even when I it's funny because when I started writing Liber 420, I knew there was a lot of this 19th century material, Crowley and Randolph and some of this, and I thought, okay, well, that would probably be what will fill the book. But I thought I was really scratching when I began to look at medieval Renaissance material, ceremonial magic, and alchemy. And I thought I might be able to get a chapter on that. In the end, I had to relegate all my 19th century material down to about one chapter, and I ended up focusing on the earlier period because there was so much more evidence for cannabis's role in both magic and alchemy than I ever realized. And again, I think it just happens to be due to being born in the right time period with the right type of thing that I was able to come across this, along with the millions of books that have been scanned and entered into Google search engines, were many Latin manuscripts going back to the 16th, 17th century. And fortunately, cannabis is spelt the same way or very similarly in a lot of these Latin manuscripts. You can narrow down time periods, search just the 16th century or whatever, and search through books from that time period, And I began to do this, and most of the stuff is just, agriculture information, how to grow for fiber or seed. But once in a while, there'd be some alchemical text by somebody like Lull or some other famous alchemist, Giordano Cardano or something like that, And then you go, okay, let's look at this. And I was able to identify references to cannabis as arcanums, which is a sacred elixir in alchemy, also known as quintessences, which represent the fifth essence. And this was, again, basically tincturing. Tincturing was a holy act in alchemy. Even the making of, a strong alcohol was an alchemical art. They would like take wine, bury it, let it separate, keep the clear liquid, repeat this process, 5 times until they got a really potent clear liquid that was a very strong alcohol substance. And then they would take plants and they would put in the plants and then take the plants out, put more plants in, take it out, and they would get what they thought was the fifth essence, the soul of the plant, into this tincture, which was considered a chemical heaven. And so it would take the essence, the quintessence, the fifth essence, into itself as the chemical heaven. And Paracelsus and others perfected this art, and they wrote, specifically about cannabis and opium and other such plants being used in such tinctures. It's firm that there was a very powerful role in spagyric alchemy for cannabis and other psychoactive substances now. Well documented. And in magic, some of the oldest magical manuscripts, such as the Picatrix, which goes back to the 10th century Gayat al-Hakim, an Islamic book of magic that was translated into Latin in the 10th or 12th century, I forget, but was kind of like the founding document of the magical tradition. And there's references to hashish in there for magical purposes, and we know later references, we talked about the anointing oil in the biblical, well, later magical texts influenced by the Bible, such as the Sefer Raziel, Liber Salomonis, they prescribe cannabis mixed with other plants for seeing visions in magic mirrors. And this is one of the purposes that Randolph and other occult people use cannabis. They would take cannabis and sometimes other substances, and they would stare into opaque mirrors until they began to see shapes and things like that. And then they would start trying to interpret this and even meet things in there. And this was like a tool for interacting with the unconscious in much the same way we interact with the unconscious when we dream and stuff like that. Very powerful magical tool. And cannabis has a long, long association with this particular act. Likely this was a method used by Dr. John Dee and his associate Edward Kelly. Mm-hmm. They write about incenses being used, ointments, and other chemicals, being used in Dee's books of his accounts with spirits. There's clear references that indicate the use of such psychoactive preparations. This is really, really, really profound stuff.
Yeah, man, you are hitting all the right things. I'm firing on all cylinders and you're connecting them so perfectly. As you mentioned, the Solomonic magic and how Solomon was, using this type of thing to literally bind demons into magic mirrors. And this is fascinating that these same practices basically infiltrated United States mysticism. I mean, that's just blatant and in our face within a more contemporary time. But as you said, this has been going on for ages. And one of my favorite subjects, and I don't know if you did this just by accident or coincidence, around page 420, witches and weed. I find this absolutely fascinating as I'm very deeply involved in researching shapeshifters, Native American folklore, skinwalkers, etc. But the witches' ointments, as you write in your book, are particularly involved as a vehicle which enable the witch to travel, and that this is in a variety of ways. And, it seems as if just about every major religion, spiritual idea, even secret society, there is a very obvious and hard to ignore foundation that is surrounded by the ideas of cannabis.
Well, I agree. Yeah. You can take a look at all the major religions, Taoism. There's Taoist references to cannabis going back 2,700 years ago. And here's a quatrain, I think, written around 400 BC. First yin, then a yang. No one knows what I do. Jade buds of holy hemp for the one that lives apart. They would burn it in incense burners to travel to the other world and things like that. And there's well-known documentation of this. And they likely picked it up off the practices of the Gushi that I was referring to earlier, because they were there in the same time period. It was when later Confucianism came into play that these practices fell out of favor. In India, it's still used in rituals to Shiva, who's the oldest continually worshipped god on earth. In the Shinto religion of Japan, taima is a sacred paper, sacred cloth, sacred incense. And that's another ancient religion that is pre-European contact. We've already talked about the Hebrew religion. I believe this continues on in the early Christian period. And there's a good case to be made for the role of these same anointing oils we were talking about and incenses in the Hebrew period throughout the early Christian period, particularly among Gnostic groups, where there's clear evidence of entheogen ingestion. In Zoroastrian religion, which is very influential on magic, they were known as the Ancient Magi, and also on both the Hebrew and Christian and Islamic religion, very influential on them. Clearly, there's these references to cannabis-infused wines and other preparations as well. And in Islam as well, Sufis and dervishes have a long history with hashish. And there's even texts like the Dabistan that refer to the Prophet himself ingesting bhang. And so really interesting stuff, you know what I mean? And we're talking about the early periods of these traditions, which is really important, the inspirational period before they just became dead traditions. And what I mean by about a dead tradition is it's like the Bible. It's a document. It's not like a thriving, living thing. It's not like there's new revelations happening and stuff like that. It's just, okay, we keep going back to this one thing that happened, way back when, and that's it. And that's where it stopped, Cannabis is the representative of the living tradition, man. It's the tree of life, which all these different faiths, these different nationalities sprouted from, the common factor, the common root, man. And like I say, I think that this is the time where that's going to become a reality, where people are going to reawaken to this magic, to this the reality of the spiritual world,
It's a really big deal, Chris. And the way that you have been showing people the historical role of cannabis in the spiritual life of humanity is a really big deal. It's very noble of you. Kind of fast forward to something recent and how, people are scared of Fridays that fall on the 13th, as happened earlier this month. I find it very interesting and I'm fascinated by the Hashashin, or those assassins that the Knights Templar gained so much knowledge for and most likely burned at the stake for. Can we go into that just a little bit to kind of wrap things up?
Absolutely. Friday the 13th is of course, the day they were rounded up by the church. It's interestingly enough that at two of the major Templar raids, both in England and in France, cannabis was reported. Large amounts of cannabis was reported on the list of seized items. They don't go into the detail anything other than it was cannabis, but if it was cloth or rope, it would have been listed as such, because all these items were specifically identified in these seizure lists of the church when they raided the Templars, And long before I ever wrote about this, there was claims that the Templars had come into contact with the Hashashins, or a group known more modernly as the Assassins. And there's a long-standing etymological theory that hashish and assassin come from the same root, and this earlier term Hashashin. And the Hashashin, a lot of people say that this was just a term labeled at them by their enemies. They never used hashish, but became associated with them because it was a way to attack them and stuff like that. But I don't think these people realize the esoteric history and connection to hashish. And the Hashashin are an Islamic group that was very, very influenced by the Persian Zoroastrians, which I mentioned earlier. And in the famous tale coming, and you got to remember, like, a lot of the history you know about them come from people that are against them or Europeans, like Marco Polo. And one of the accusations made against him was that the leader of the assassins would get young men up to his mountain abode, and he'd dose them with hashish and say he's going to show them paradise, and they'd take so much they'd get knocked out, and they'd wake up in a paradisal garden surrounded by beautiful nymphs, and then he'd dose them again, and they'd wake up, and he'd say, see, now you've seen paradise, you must serve me if you ever want to go there again, right? That's the myth. But in many ways, it's like just kind of a continuation of the Zoroastrian use of cannabis-infused wines. And we know from texts like the Book of Ardu Viraf or accounts of King Vistaspa that the Zoroastrians, for religious purposes, in order to enter the other world, would consume wine mixed with banga. Sometimes it's used in the term man. And these are terms that are largely translated as cannabis, although some have suggested henbane and other drugs. I think if you really take a close look at the etymology, and I lay all this out in my book, it's pretty clearly cannabis. And cannabis-infused wines were very well known in the ancient world. These aren't the only references to them. And they would take enough to get knocked out, and they'd see their vision, and they'd come back and say what they had seen. And the only cultural difference here is, the religion itself. And in the Islamic afterworld, there's, you're surrounded by virgins. You get, 60 virgins or 70 virgins, 72 virgins or something like that. And this is what all replayed in the myth of the assassin, the effects of the infused wine. But likewise, when Ardu Viraf drinks it in the Zoroastrian religion, he goes to heaven and hell. And this is where the whole concept of heaven and hell come from, are the Zoroastrian accounts, right? And leaked into Christianity. It wasn't part of Judaism. And so the idea is that the Templars had come into contact with the Hashashins, picked up this esoteric use of cannabis. And there's been numbers of claims in books that there was an elixir of Jerusalem that was a combination of cannabis and aloe vera mixed into a palm wine. It was called the elixir of Jerusalem. But I've never been able to find anything past the 70s indicating it. But when I did look back into time period documents, as I mentioned, involving the arrests, it was clear that cannabis was seized from 2 Templar sites during the raids, and also that the Templars had under contract Saracens, Arabs, growing cannabis for them in Spain. And Arab people were not very well versed in growing fiber cannabis. They knew about growing resin cannabis in that region. And Spain grows excellent resin cannabis as well. So it seems most likely that the Saracens under contract by the Templars growing cannabis were growing resin cannabis, and that there may be something to these elixir of Jerusalem claims that still may emerge. But it's clear that on the seized items list, that cannabis was seized from Templar sites. And, the Templars, it's believed they may have picked up on Gnostic practices in the Holy Land. And this is largely an accusation brought against them. And we see, again, these types of infusions used by the Gnostics and carried down even into the Islamic period. We know groups like the Sabians were basically Gnostic sects that were still going. There's still some Gnostic sects in Iraq as well, up to this day. So that's another avenue it could have come through.
Mm-hmm. Man, your knowledge of the historical role of cannabis in the spiritual life of humanity is phenomenal, Chris. You've joined the masters, in my opinion, with the literary works you've provided that have an overwhelming amount of evidence. And these are topics which have been hidden by the leaders of the modern world and elites for pretty much all time that I know of. Lastly, with the Templars mentioned, could cannabis be the Holy Grail?
Well, I think there's a lot to that claim. You know, there's a lot of like perjured origins to the Grail mythology. The cup of Jephtha, I think it was called as well. And Graha is like the term for the cup that Soma is drunk from. And there's all these Persian connections to him and cannabis-infused wines. Like in the Ardu Vera story, he drinks from golden cups, the wine, you know, like the cannabis-infused wines. So there's a lot of connection there. Yeah, I think that the Grail could well be cannabis. And that's not just my opinion. Other people have written about that, like Professor George Luck also suggested this as well, you know. And I think that if you take a look at the evidence for it, it's quite convincing that, you know, the Grail is described as something that's both root and branch. I certainly think that's a much stronger case than, you know, the Badgett and Lay theory about bloodline of Jesus. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a lot more to it than that when you read about the role of sacred cups. And you see these same sort of sacred cups for cannabis use even amongst the Scythians. And there's a Scythian connection to the Grail as well. Yeah, there's a really powerful case for it, I think.
Awesome stuff, Chris. Awesome stuff. My hat's off to you. Where can listeners get all of your books? What's the best website for them to keep up with your research? And what do you have out there? Where can they find you?
I keep a blog over at cannabisculture.com, and I post a lot of historical material in my blog. And you can find my books on Amazon, probably best if you're interested in the ancient world. Start with Cannabis and the Soma Solution. I cover a lot of different ancient cultures in there. All this biblical material that I've been talking about, this Islamic material, Taoist material is all covered in Cannabis and Soma Solution because it's all interrelated to the history of Soma. And the occult stuff, Liber 420 is your best bet. It's all covered in there. I've got a new book coming out, The Lost Sacrament, that will be going over all this biblical stuff in light of the latest archaeological evidence. And I've got some videos, documentaries on YouTube. There's one called Cannabis, the history of cannabis in the Old Testament, that goes into details about this linguistic argument, but the video was put together before this archaeological evidence came out confirming it. And if you search my name in cannabis in Google or YouTube, there's lots of articles and interviews and things like that will pop up if you want to hear more of my blab.
It's great stuff, Chris. I can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast. I always love keeping up with what you're doing, and wishing you the best, my man. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The modern mage, the mystic, the researcher of the historical role of cannabis in the spiritual life of humanity. He's been doing this for more than a quarter century. Chris Bennett. He is the author of Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana in Magic and Religion, Sex, Drugs, Violence and the Bible, and author of Cannabis and the Soma Solution, not to mention this amazing book, Liber 420, Cannabis, Magical Herbs, and the Occult. It seems that no matter how far back we looked, there are detailed historical references that Chris has explored which tie cannabis to underground and occulted facts in the mystery schools, religions, and history itself. So definitely support Chris, support his books, pick them up. They are a must-have in everyone's library. Don't accept the lies and find out more of which is hid behind the veil. Until next time, keep your eyes to the skies, feet on the ground, but don't forget to take a look around.
Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like it need Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like it need Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off.